Thank you all for joining us. I'm Steve Snyder. I'm the president and CEO of the Fleet Science Center. That's that building virtually behind me. Thank you all for joining me here in the park tonight, at least virtually. We are excited to have you here and our guests and to have this discussion. I'll also just share with you briefly that while we haven't seen many of you in the park for quite a while, at least over a year, the fleet will be reopening on April 9th. So look forward to seeing you back in the building at that point in time. But tonight we're really focused on a really important discussion that we know is important to everyone across our community. Over the last year, the COVID pandemic has certainly had a huge impact on all of the communities of San Diego. And we know that response that we've mustered to this issue has been a community response. And likewise, the vaccines that are now out are the result of a scientific and engineering community's work. It's no one scientist. This is not the Salk vaccine or Fleming's discovery of. This is something that really has involved biologists and chemists and physicists and engineers of every kind, and logisticians and data scientists, all working together over a number of years to pull on research to create what is a brand new tool to hopefully help us in dealing with the challenges that we're facing in light of COVID-19. And as like with any new tool, questions come up. What is this? How does it use it? What are the challenges? And we know lots of people have lots of different questions. So what we wanted to do tonight was really bring together a group of folks who have the expertise, who have been in the trenches in all aspects of the vaccine, from issues of looking at development to approvals to implementation, to really be able to get to your questions and help everyone understand really how this new tool can be used to help us all move forward. So thank you all for joining us, and thank the panelists for joining us. I'd like to take a moment also to thank our folks who have helped underwrite this event tonight: Heron Therapeutics, INOVIO, Organovo, Samumed, Pfizer, and Biocom. So thank you all for your support of this. I also want to give a special shout out to Kimberly Manhart. She's our trustee who has been spearheading this evening's programming. So thank you all for that. So again, welcome to all of you. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight, our panelists for tonight, and then turn it over to them so we can really get into some initial discussions and information sharing, and then importantly get to your questions, which of course is the most important part of our discussion. So to start with, we'll pick on here Dr. Kate Broderick. She's an accomplished scientist, a recognized vaccine expert, and she leads a team of folks as Senior Vice President of Research and Development at INOVIO. In particular, they're working on DNA vaccine for COVID-19. It's in development, and developing DNA medicines and a number of ways to implement them for anything from a range of issues from cancer to deadly infectious diseases. She received her PhD from the University of Glasgow in Scotland and conducted postdoctoral research at the University of California, San Diego. Next up is Dr. Mark Sawyer. He's a professor of clinical pediatrics and pediatric infectious disease specialist at UCSD School of Medicine and the Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. He's the medical director of UCSD San Diego Immunization Partnership, which is a contract between the San Diego County Agency for Health and Human Services that's really designed to improve immunization delivery in San Diego, obviously a very important issue right now. He's a past member of the American Academy Pediatrics Committee on Infectious Diseases, the FDA Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, and the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And recently he was recalled back to the Products Advisory Committee to do work on the emergency use authorization applications for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine vaccines that we're now looking at. And he's also a member of the Western States COVID Vaccine Scientific Safety Review Work Group. Dr. Jeannette Aldous is Clinical Director of Infectious Disease for San Ysidro Health. She received her medical degree from UCSD, completed her residency in internal medicine at University of Colorado Hospital, and she came back to UCSD initially for infectious disease fellowship. And she spent her career focusing on health disparities in historically underserved communities. And she's the director of San Ysidro Health's HIV, tuberculosis, and infectious disease and gender-affirming medicine programs. And since March of 2020, she's also directed San Ysidro Health's COVID-19 response and serves on the San Diego COVID Equity Task Force, Supervisor Fletcher's Health Equity Subcommittee, and the county's Vaccine Clinical Advisory Group. Then we have Dr. Jamal Gwathney. He's a board-certified family medicine physician for over 20 years, and he's currently active duty captain in the United States Public Health Service. During his career, he served with underserved communities across the county and the world. He's been medical director of a community health center in Washington, D.C. He was deployed to help lead a unit in the fight against Ebola in Liberia. Supported community of Flint, Michigan during the lead water crisis. A personal thank you for me and my family who are in the Flint area, and has been stationed as medical director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons facility in San Diego for the past 8 years. He's very committed to improving care for communities of color and has been heavily involved in the COVID-19 patient care and vaccination information administration. And finally, our moderator for tonight is Dr. Jonathan Wosen. He's the San Diego Union-Tribune's biotech reporter. He's a doctorate in immunology from Stanford. He was an intern at Stat News, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, a knowledgeable magazine. A native San Diegan, he grew up in Oak Park. He's a proud graduate of Washington Carver Elementary School and the Preuss School at UCSD. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. We're really excited for you to share your knowledge and experience in this and to answer questions. And to all the people out there joining us tonight, thank you for coming. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Wosen to start us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. So the way we're going to do this, which you may have just heard a little bit about a moment ago, is that we got a lot of questions coming into the event, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as we can out the gate. So each of the panelists have prepared a couple quick slides that will hopefully answer the questions that were sent in advance. And then we'll spend about a half hour going through that. And then we'll save the next hour to answer your questions. So if you see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, feel free to ask questions as people are presenting. And once we get to that part of the discussion, I'll try to direct questions to our panelists, and we can hopefully spend as much time as possible answering your vaccine questions. So we'll start with Kate Broderick, and she'll be talking a bit about some SARS-CoV-2 basics as well as a few general vaccine points.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thank you to you for your reporting over the last 15 months now. I think now more than ever, we really need to get actual facts from the media, so we're all very appreciative of everything you've been doing. I also wanted to start by saying thank you very much for including me in this panel session, and thank you so much to the Fleet Science Centre for organising it. When you think about where we were even a year ago and what we've achieved in the last 12 to 15 months, it's absolutely remarkable. We've now got incredibly effective vaccines, ready to be used by huge segments of the population here in the US and globally as well. But frankly, developing vaccines isn't what saves lives. It's actually getting people vaccinated with those vaccines. And so events like this hopefully can be there as kind of a conversation to really allow people to make the decisions that they need to make for their families, for themselves, for society as a whole, to make the choice about going out to get vaccinated, because really that's what's going to really assist us in ending this terrible pandemic. And lastly, I want to say I'm really honoured to be on the panel with Dr. Aldous, Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Gwathney, because I'm really looking forward to hearing their reflections as we move through tonight's slides and questions. Jonathan, is it possible for me to get my slides up on the screen? Oh, perfect, great, thank you so much. So I am going to spend the next 5 minutes or so sort of level setting for everybody a little bit on COVID-19. Some of this you might have heard ad nauseum a little bit, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page, we'll go through some of the basics. We'll talk a little bit about the different vaccines that are available, and Dr. Sawyer is going to elaborate on that too. And then lastly, I wanted to talk really about what you might have heard about in the media, these new variants that are circulating. That's something that's really keeping me busy at the moment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that just to make sure everybody felt comfortable with what that meant and what the implications to the pandemic are. So just a few facts. So obviously, as many of you all know, COVID-19 is caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2. It's a coronavirus, similar to the viruses that cause MERS and SARS, which you might remember from kind of being in the media several years ago. You're looking at pictures of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, as you see, and if you look at the bottom right, that's actually an electron microscope of picture of the viruses themselves. And I personally think viruses really, withstanding the fact of the death and destruction that they cause, they're really quite beautiful little entities, and really quite remarkable in the fact of how simplistic they are, and yet the devastation that they're able to cause. So what you're looking at here, and in the top picture and the bottom picture highlighted in red, is what we're calling the spike protein. And what is that? Well, that's the part of the virus. If you think of kind of the virus and our human cells as kind of a lock and key event, so really the spike protein is the thing on the outside of the virus that allows the virus and the human cell to have an interaction in together. And the reason that they stick out on top of the virus is one of the reasons why most of the vaccines that we're going to talk about tonight have been developed against that very specific part of the virus, the spike protein, that red thing that looks a little bit like a lollipop that sticks off the surface of the virus. So next slide, please. So one thing that you can say for sure that's common between every virus that we know about is their ability to mutate. And what I mean when I say mutate is viruses are able to introduce subtle changes into their genetic material. So think about it as the kind of blueprint for the virus itself. They go through these changes and they're able to introduce these little changes, which may have no impact at all on the virus, or in some cases actually might make them better at doing their jobs, or conversely make them worse at infecting other things. The situation where you're probably most familiar with this mutation ability of a virus is with the flu virus, and that is why every year we have to go and get a different annual flu shot every year. And that's because the flu virus does a fantastic job of changing itself, kind of to almost like putting on a new disguise so that it can kind of trick our bodies and escape those immune responses that we develop season to season. And really SARS-CoV-2, or the virus that causes COVID-19, is no different from that. And that's exactly what it's doing right now. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So what you've probably all read about or heard about in the media are these new strains of the virus that causes COVID-19. So I wanted to talk a little bit about them and what those actually mean. So the three you probably most commonly heard about is the one that originated in the UK, and then there's one originated in South Africa and one in Brazil. So let's start on the one in the UK. And just to give you a little bit of a fact here, which I think is just absolutely remarkable, in February, if people who got positive COVID tests, 1% of those COVID tests were caused by this new variant that came from the United Kingdom. Today, that's the dominant strain within the US. So within a very short period of time, that new virus strain has really kind of taken over, has become the most infectious strain within the US. So you can really see how quickly, when it comes to things like the virus spread, it can really, really change within a fairly short period of time. The good news about the UK strain is that the vaccines that have been developed so far are still completely effective against that new strain. It certainly seems to be more transmissible, so it seems to be able to infect a bit better than the original strain. But again, the good news is the vaccines seem to work really well against this new strain. Unfortunately, for the South African and the Brazilian strains that originated in those countries, that doesn't seem to be the case. The vaccines do seem to be somewhat impacted by these new strains. They don't seem as good, as effective, we might say, against these new strains. And certainly if you've read anything in the media at the moment about the situation in Brazil, they're really having very difficult time in really getting a lid on this new mutant strain, it's really caused a huge burden on their healthcare system. So the good news is they are here in the States, but they don't seem to be terribly widespread, nothing like as widespread as what we're seeing for the UK strains. But it's really, really important, as a society, that we are constantly monitoring these different mutants, these different strains, so we can kind of keep ahead of the virus so that we know what it's up to, that we know the changes it's about to make. So that's something that's really important that's going on. And then last slide. And then this is really just to talk about the fact that there are many, many different types of vaccines for all sorts of different infectious diseases you can think about. And this is really just kind of a nice summary slide that I shamelessly stole from Al Jazeera, but it really nicely kind of gives an idea of all the different types of vaccines that are available for a variety of different diseases. The two that are probably, of course, of most importance to talk about tonight are the RNA vaccines, and those are the ones that were developed by Pfizer and by Moderna, and the viral vector vaccines, and those are the ones that were developed by J&J, and also you've probably heard about the AstraZeneca vaccine as well. My personal area of speciality is the DNA vaccines, the one sandwiched between the two there. So an RNA vaccine takes a tiny little piece of the genetic sequence of the virus, sort of covers it in this layer of fat, and that's injected into you and is able to generate these amazing immune responses. And viral vectored vaccines, again, take that little piece of the genetic material or the blueprint of the virus, and instead of putting them in a fat droplet, they put them inside another virus that's really effective at infecting cells, and that's the way that they get it into the body. So I'm going to leave it there and pass it on to Dr. Sawyer, who is going to elaborate on these different vaccines and also the different processes and approval pathways that it takes to get vaccines developed. Over to you, Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you all tonight and to join this panel, which really has a great breadth of expertise and looks at this whole problem from different angles. I want to reiterate what Dr. Broderick said, that it is amazing that we've gotten to where we have gotten in such a short period of time. This is an unprecedented accomplishment, and it's due to the science background that was working on related topics over the last decades, and it's how we move forward as a community in the medical world. I'm primarily going to focus on the approval process and how it works, just to make sure everyone is clear, and also address the very common question, how did we get here so fast without cutting corners and risking approving vaccines that might not be safe or might not be effective? So I've been part of this process, so I can share my personal experience with it, starting with the FDA. So the job of the FDA in the United States is to approve new drugs and vaccines and devices. And there is an advisory committee to the FDA called VRBPAC, the Vaccines and Related Biologics Advisory Committee. And that's a group of non-governmental experts in the fields of vaccines and biology and virology, who come together to review the same data that the FDA reviews and give our opinion about whether we think the FDA should or should not approve a certain product. So the FDA takes whatever data the company submits to them and reviews it for accuracy. They also inspect the manufacturing facilities to make sure that there's good quality control in place. And if everything is in good shape, then they issue an approval. Normally, that process takes many months, and the approval is a standard approval. In this case, because of the urgency of the pandemic, they used a mechanism called the emergency use authorization, which allows them to more quickly review the data and tentatively approve the product, which means that the company still has to gather additional data before they reach full approval. But in the meantime, we can start using the vaccine. And that's what's happened with each of the three vaccines that we currently have. They are issued under what's called an EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. They will subsequently go under the final review process and be fully released probably within a matter of months. So that's one advisory group. The second group that then takes over after there is an emergency use authorization is an advisory committee from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. This is called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. This committee's job is to say, okay, we have a new vaccine. How should we use it? Who should get it? And under what circumstances should they get it? They look at the feasibility of distributing the vaccine. They look at side effects. They look at who's at risk for disease and who isn't. And out of that comes a set of recommendations from the ACIP. In the case of the COVID vaccines, this group is the one that has decided and helped generate the rollout of the new vaccine, since we did not have enough to give everybody a dose right at the beginning. They went through very careful deliberation about the prioritization of who should get the vaccine first, and that led to the tiers of vaccine distribution that you've now become familiar with. We're working our way through those tiers, and we're getting very close to opening up vaccine for anybody who wants it. And again, it's astounding how quickly the manufacturers have been able to ramp up production, and the public health and provider community has figured out how to give vaccine to large numbers of people in a short period of time. The last group that I want to mention is a unique group that was originally conceived by the governor of California, this Western States Scientific Safety Review Group. That's something that never existed before. And I think the governor was concerned that there was so much information and a fair amount of misinformation being circulated about COVID vaccines that he wanted a committee of California scientists to help him make sure that he was making, and the California Department of Public Health was making the right decisions about use of these vaccines in Californians. It subsequently expanded because the states of Oregon, Washington, and Nevada were also interested in the same thing, so it became the Western States Scientific Review Group. And I've been participating in that group as well, and that group takes the data that the FDA and the recommendations from the ACIP and just interprets them in the context of California and what's happening in California so that we can make statewide recommendations that make sense for us. So that's the infrastructure that approves vaccine. If we can go on to the next slide, I'm going to share with you sort of the process, the steps in the process of the development of these vaccines, and explain how we got here so fast. So the technology for all of these vaccines already existed and had been worked on for years. So mRNA vaccines, although we had not used them routinely yet in human populations, there was a lot of background work that led the manufacturers to be prepared on very short notice to produce vaccines once we learned about SARS-CoV-2. And the real trick to speeding all of this up is in the sort of blue and greenish bars here, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, which is the normal mechanism for studying any new drug or vaccine. Typically, those happen sequentially. You finish one, then you start the next one, you finish the second one, then you finish that, you start the third one. In this case, they were sort of overlapped. And the only reason that was feasible is that the money to fund that came from the federal government. Ordinarily, a manufacturer could not risk the financial outlay to do it that quickly without taking a very deliberate stepwise approach. So that is a fundamental part of the speeding up of these vaccines. And it went so far as to have the manufacturers start producing vaccine lots for distribution before we even knew that the vaccines were going to be approved, which is a gamble that a company normally would never take. But because of the federal funding, they were able to do that. So that takes us down to the review by the FDA Advisory Committee, which I've already talked about. The FDA worked overtime, weekends, Thanksgiving weekend included, to review the data that was submitted, and the committee then met on very short notice to issue the EUA. The very next day, the CDC committee met. Normally, that would be a gap of weeks, if not a month or so. In this case, it was a gap of just a day. And the CDC issued recommendations for how to distribute it. So that's how we got to where we are. Nothing was omitted. Again, I was on the Vaccine Advisory Committee for FDA in the past and rejoined for this effort. And I can tell you that that process was exactly the same as it always was. There was nothing different about it. It just was sped up because of each of the steps in between. The last thing I want to say is that we're not done reviewing these vaccines. As I mentioned, they will come under full FDA review shortly, but the CDC has also developed a very extensive safety monitoring program, building new infrastructure to study the millions of people who have now received the COVID vaccines to make sure that we don't miss any rare, unusual side effects. There was a lot of concern about the safety of these vaccines as they were being developed. And I can assure you, we have a very good picture of their safety now. And you've read about certain things in the media, but I can say as a generalization, these vaccines are as safe as any other vaccine that we use routinely. We could have the next slide. What all of this has led to at this moment is 3 vaccines that are approved by FDA in the United States, the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer, and the Moderna. Here's some facts about them. And the one thing I want to focus on is the effectiveness number. There's a great tendency to try to simplify this whole scientific discussion by that one number, but I want to caution people against doing that. These vaccines were studied at different time periods. In particular, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied later when the variants that Dr. Broderick mentioned were starting to circulate. In fact, part of their study population was in South Africa, where the most resistant virus was. So the fact that their effectiveness, at least based on this single number, appears lower is in part due to that. And in addition, another thing we've learned about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that even after the time period at which the immune response or the effectiveness was measured, your body continues to adapt and get better at responding to the vaccine over the subsequent weeks, so that you're even more protected at 4 weeks after vaccine than after 2. So again, there is very hard to compare. You really shouldn't compare these vaccines head to head because of the different circumstances in which they're under. They all protect against severe disease and hospitalization, which is the ultimate thing we want to prevent. They're all essentially equivalent in that outcome measure. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has some advantages or different characteristics that make it useful in certain circumstances. For example, it's only a 1-dose vaccine, and also its storage makes it easier to distribute vaccine in remote communities. So stay tuned. We will learn much more about these vaccines as time goes on, and there will be additional vaccines coming. And if I could go to my last slide, I just want to address a few common questions that come up about the vaccine. At first, there was concern that your SARS-CoV test might be falsely positive because you've been vaccinated. That is not the case. It is okay if you get vaccinated, even if you've already had SARS-CoV-2 infection. So that's safe to do. We really don't know yet whether we can mix the various products together. So you should really try to get the exact same vaccine that you started with for the 2-dose products, at least until we learn more about that. The spacing between the 2 doses is important only on the short side. So I'm sure you've read that the Pfizer vaccine 2 doses are given 3 weeks apart. The Moderna vaccine are given 4 weeks apart. You don't want to make it any shorter than that, but it's okay if it's longer. So if for some reason you can't get your second dose at 3 or 4 weeks and it takes 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, that's not a problem. The vaccine will still work. Your immune system will still respond. I do want everybody to be aware that there are side effects from these vaccines, which are short-term and minor, but you should be aware of them and prepared for them. You can have fever and feel sort of not your normal self and a little achy for 24 or 48 hours. Those reactions for the 2-dose products seem to be more pronounced in the second dose and the younger the population. So just be aware of that as you're experiencing the vaccines and your family members are. That's normal. In fact, that's a good sign. It means your immune system is responding. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Aldous, who can carry us to the next topic.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Just to reiterate, again, I'm Jeannette Aldous. I work at San Ysidro Health, and I'm an infectious disease physician. And I want to just repeat what Dr. Sawyer said, because some of it is so important, because I'm seeing patients now in clinic, and the number one questions I get from them are, was this rushed? And I don't want to be first. And I think Dr. Sawyer really nicely explained that, what I say to my patients is, this is what happens when you throw money at the problem. So we didn't skip anything, but if you are committed and you put money into the problem, you can do a lot. And that's what happened here. And also a lot of my patients say, well, I don't want to be first. In fact, my own dad said he didn't want to be first. And I said, well, don't worry, Dad, because millions of people have now gotten this vaccine. So that's something else to remember. Everything feels so fast. It feels like everything is so new. But in fact, this went through all of the usual processes with the FDA, and millions of people have now already received these vaccines. So that's something to keep in mind when you get those questions about things being new or fast. So I was asked to cover just a little bit about epidemiology in San Diego County. We can go to the next slide. My job is to, first of all, remind everyone that we are still in a pandemic. So these are some numbers that were pulled from today. Our current case rate is 6.8 cases per 100,000. We used to be so high in December and January. You remember how things were awful. It was a terrible time for the county. Many people lost family members. It was exhausting for healthcare providers. And so because things are better now, I think there's this feeling that, we're on the road to recovery, and that is great. But we are really just back to like October numbers. So please keep that in perspective when we look at the case rates. The majority of San Diegans are still not protected with vaccination. We still, I think we had about 300 cases today. We still have hundreds of cases per day. So we're back to last fall. We're not back to 2019 when there was no pandemic. I also want to just touch on some of these numbers look better, and remember that we were at maximum ICU capacity in the winter. And like I said, it was a really dark time. And a reminder of the overall impact of the pandemic. So this is the cases we've had in San Diego, which is not that large a place to have 270,000 cases and 3,500 deaths. Nationwide, we've had 500,000 deaths from this pandemic. So people sometimes say, well, mostly you're not going to die, and what are my chances really, and is this a lot worse than the flu? To put that into perspective, the estimates for flu deaths in our country are somewhere between 20 and like 60,000 per year. Usually average, you say about 50,000 deaths per year from the flu. So you're talking about orders of magnitude more deaths in a very short period of time in this country. So absolutely, this has been a much greater health crisis than anyone that we've faced in our generations. And I wanted to point out here these very important numbers about health disparities and the populations impacted. I think anyone who's been paying any attention knows that our country experiences significant health disparities, and especially among Black and Brown people in this country. And this pandemic has really made that evident. So right here at home, our county is about 35% Latino, and Latinos have made up 55% of the cases in San Diego County, and a great number of the deaths. And where I work at San Ysidro Health, we're serving the zip codes that have been very heavily impacted. And you can just really see the difference this year. We could talk for hours, which we're not going to, about why, but a lot of this has to do with really structural inequities in our county and our country. And if you think about who our essential workers are and who had to go out during the pandemic versus who was able to stay in their homes and work remotely, you can see why certain communities were more impacted. So we can go to the next slide. Even though I just told you that we've had a very disproportionate impact among Latinos, and especially in San Diego County, we still have quite a ways to do in rectifying that situation. So I do want to pause and give a lot of appreciation to our county, to our partners, to Dr. Sawyer and others who have been on committees, really looking at health equity in San Diego County. There has been a ton of focus and work on health equity. But you can see that we needed that effort, needed that work, because we still have a long way to go. So this is a picture of who has been vaccinated so far in San Diego County. You can see that 21% of the vaccines have gone to Hispanic or Latinos, even though I just told you that that's the community that bore the biggest burden of disease and death from COVID-19. So that's an inequity that we are focused very heavily on. Health centers like mine and other partners in the community that really focus on health disparities have been able to vaccinate much higher proportions of people of color and low-income people in the county. So that's a strong focus of our vaccine response in San Diego County. We can go to the next slide. And so when you listen to discussions at the state level, at the federal level, at the local level about the vaccine, you will hear a ton of language about health equity. And so we really need to make sure we're all using the right words here. So equality would be if we just said, everyone can sign up for the vaccine, just get on the web. You all have equal access, right? And that's equality, but that's not equity. So equity is recognizing those disparities and saying, we're going to shift our programs to really focus on breaking down barriers for the communities that need the vaccine the most. And that's what that equity picture is. And you can see the difference. And so when we talk about health equity, we need to make sure we're talking about the same thing, which is tailoring our response to the needs of the community. And of course, meanwhile, we're going to work on justice, right? So this won't happen again, right? The reason that we have so many health disparities is because of really issues around structural inequality and justice. So that's happening ongoingly in this country and will be really important lesson learned from the pandemic. I'll stop there and hand it off to Dr. Gwathney, who is going to talk just a little bit about herd immunity.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to try and round out this star-studded panel today. I want to definitely just comment on something that Dr. Sawyer was talking about, and was this too fast? A lot of times when I'm talking to patients, I have to educate them the normal amount of patients that we have in vaccine studies is usually 3,000 to 5,000 in that study. And we've had 30,000, 40,000 in each of these 3 studies. So we have a ton of data that lets us know this is safe and effective. So that's certainly one thing. And then as Dr. Aldous has been, talking about just the vaccine rates, I'm just going to talk a little bit about prevention and herd immunity. Let's go to the next slide, please. So prevention, as Dr. Aldous said, we are still in a pandemic and prevention still needs to happen. Of note, last week, nationwide, we had a 5% increase in cases nationwide. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, we had 19 states in the country that had an increase in coronavirus cases. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, there are 30 states with increases in coronavirus cases. So we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. So prevention strategies still need to happen. This is a great slide, Swiss cheese slices, all of them with holes. And if we use all of these techniques, then we can create the best prevention strategy we can. So we need to continue washing our hands and coughing into our elbows, the cough etiquette. We certainly need to avoid touching your face. I can remember at the beginning of the pandemic, sitting in meetings when we were having group meetings, and telling people, get your hands on your face, stop touching your face, because it's just a normal habit that we do all the time. The physically distancing, and sometimes even greater than 6 feet is what we need. Still avoiding gatherings, especially indoors. I know there's a lot of pressure for, opening up businesses, churches, things along those lines. Indoor gathering probably still is not safe at this time. Even, if we're mixing vaccinated and unvaccinated folks, it's still not recommended at this point. Wearing your face coverings, even double masking, is something that you definitely should consider. Quarantining, testing, and then we get to vaccinations. And I like the fact that even this last slice has holes in it. Vaccines are not 100%. 95, 94%, 66%. We still need to continue to do all of these other preventative steps so that as a whole, we can get out of this. Next slide, please. So herd immunity, or how do we protect our community? So basically, herd immunity is when we have enough people in the community that have become immune, either by vaccine or disease, to make the spread unlikely. So we're always trying to prevent spread of the disease. And you've heard numbers anywhere from 60% to 90% is what we need to, those numbers for herd immunity. It may lie somewhere in the middle, 80, 85%. So this slide here just, picturizes how, when no one is immunized in this first slide, and you have 2 people getting the disease, then most of the people in the community will get the disease. If you have the yellow, the next slide over, several people vaccinated, still a predominant amount of the community will get infected. The only way to prevent that is to have most of the people vaccinated. And then when you have the disease, it has nowhere to spread. Again, trying to prevent the spread. So getting people vaccinated will help prevent the spread, will help prevent the mutations that are happening. As Dr. Broderick mentioned, basically mutations are accidents, they're mistakes when a virus is replicating. If it has nowhere to replicate, then you cannot get a mutation. So the vaccine will play a critical role in preventing those mutations and those new variants as well. I'm going to finish there and pass it over back to Dr. Wosen and listen to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gwathney. So we're going to jump into probably the most important part of this, where we answer people's questions. I will try to direct those questions to different people on the panel. So, but if somebody else wants to chime in, just maybe raise your hand and we can go back and forth a little bit. The first question, and Dr. Gwathney, I'll have you take this on first. There were a number of questions in chat about that basically boil down to who can get the vaccine and who can't. So if you have a certain allergy or allergies or certain existing medical conditions, a heart condition, whatever the case may be, what do we know in terms of who can get the currently available COVID-19 vaccines? I'll start with you and then let other people chime in.
Okay. So those are 2 big groups, chronic conditions and then allergies, And so maybe we'll go with chronic conditions first. So all the studies included the common conditions: diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, lung conditions like asthma, and COPD, which is a lung issue usually related to smoking. And so all of those groups, it is safe to receive those vaccines. They are effective in those groups. Some of the audience members specifically asked about atrial fibrillation in their questions, which is a heart condition, or VTAC, or hypothyroidism specifically was asked. And again, all of those, it is safe and still effective to receive the vaccine. You should not have any concerns about getting the vaccine for those groups. Even one person asked about neurologic damage due to trauma. And again, that would be safe and effective. There are neurologic conditions that are, say, autoimmune, and that's separate, but from trauma in and of itself, should not have any concern with that. And they talked about Guillain-Barré, but I'll stop there as well.
And I also wanted to, sorry, Dr. Sawyer, do you want to chime in?
Well, I was going to just take up the allergy part of the question, because this was a point of a lot of discussion at FDA once it was first recognized as a potential problem. So back in the winter, when we first started giving vaccine to lots of people, there was a little increase in allergic reactions that caught us off guard. And it's still not completely clear what people are reacting to, but I want to start off by saying that those reactions are extremely rare. We're talking 10 cases in 1 million doses of vaccine. So it's not a reason to avoid the vaccine, but if you have an allergic reaction to dose 1, then you certainly should not get dose 2. And there's a component of the mRNA vaccines called polyethylene glycol, or PEG. If you know that you're allergic to that, you should make sure that your provider knows, because probably you shouldn't get those vaccines at this point based on what we know.
Thank you. And I was just going to ask Dr. Aldous, there were a few questions in the chat around people who are pregnant or who, plan to be or hope to be. What do we know in terms of the vaccine safety? I know you had some information on that to share.
Yeah, let me unmute. Yes, I've been getting that question a lot from my patients or from people at my health center. And the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology came out with some guidance, which I pasted it into the person who asked the question. I don't know if other people can see it as well, but they have some nice question and answers in there. And to summarize, their recommendation is, number one, for pregnant women, although there have not been clinical trials of pregnant women, they do not see any theoretical risk to pregnant women. And they also pointed out that pregnancy can be a risk factor for more severe COVID disease. And so pregnant women might have an even greater motivation to be vaccinated to protect themselves from severe COVID disease. So they recommend that vaccine not be withheld, or that pregnant women be counseled and go forward with vaccine if they would like to, and that they don't see any potential safety concerns. For lactating women, they said the same thing, but a little bit more of a stronger recommendation. They basically said, go ahead, we don't really see any issue at all. And then same thing for fertility. They made what I thought was actually kind of a strong statement. Usually we're kind of vague in the statements, but they said none of the vaccines cause infertility. So that was kind of interesting. I put that in the link there. But so obviously, again, these vaccines have not been studied in pregnant women, but they did not see any concerns with infertility, and they recommended that women choose the vaccine, including women who are planning a future pregnancy. And I'm just paraphrasing the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So please use that link to actually read their own wording. They have a nice, frequently asked questions for patients in there.
Thank you. And just maybe on the subject of groups that can or can't get the vaccine, the current vaccine, I think Moderna's vaccine is authorized for people 18 and up, Pfizer people 16 and up. Dr. Sawyer, just wondering if you can speak to when we'll know whether the vaccines are safe and effective in children.
Yeah, vaccine is definitely coming for children. The companies have already studied adolescents down to 12 years of age. Those studies are finished, and I expect that the companies will send that data to the FDA, and the age range will be dropped to age 12, as long as the studies confirm that the vaccines worked as well, which is what I would expect. And studies are starting right now, including here in San Diego, of children all the way down to 6 months of age. So I would anticipate it'll take us through the summer to gather that data, but I'm thinking by fall or winter, this coming winter, we will be able to vaccinate all age groups, at least down to 6 months of age. And that should help us with any concerns about spreading in schools, which I know is another topic of great concern in the community.
So it sounds like the COVID-19 vaccine could in the future be one of the many vaccines that people get very early in life.
Yes.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, well, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the earlier we can prevent disease, even though children generally don't get severe disease, we have had many children at Rady Children's Hospital in the intensive care unit with COVID. So it is not something that you want to have happen if we can avoid it. And we will be able to when the vaccines get approved.
Okay.
Can I just comment really quickly and on the children? And as we know, there are those rare conditions that children can get from coronavirus. And as Dr. Aldous mentioned, in pregnant women, there was a recent study that actually the antibodies from vaccinated women actually do cross and protect the baby. And so, and that's the normal process for a lot of antibodies from other vaccines. So it will protect infants, and it's not harmful that we are aware of right now. So it's always good to consider getting vaccinated prior to pregnancy or if you are pregnant.
Okay. And there are a couple of questions in here about, if you're scheduled to receive a different vaccine, whether it's a flu shot or a vaccine for some other virus, if it's okay to also get coronavirus vaccine, and maybe how far apart you have to space those. And then maybe another related question might be, Dr. Sawyer, you mentioned if you've had COVID, natural infection, you can still go ahead and get the vaccine. Is that a good idea? Do we think that you can expect some additional benefit there? So I guess if you can speak to both of those questions.
Yeah, we're still learning things about the second question, which is after you've had natural infection, when and if you still need to be vaccinated. The current advice is yes, you can and probably should still get vaccinated, but there's no hurry. You can wait at least 3 months, and the more recent data suggests maybe you can wait 6 months after you had natural infection before you get a boost with vaccine. That story might be influenced by these variants and what happens with them as they start to circulate. If it turns out the variants are evading the vaccine and you need a new formulation of the vaccine, then of course, people who've had previous infection will still need to be vaccinated. With regard to spacing with other vaccines, the CDC's recommended waiting 2 weeks on either side of another vaccine. In other words, if you got your flu vaccine, you should wait 2 weeks before getting a COVID vaccine, and then, or if you got the COVID vaccine first, you should wait 2 weeks to get the second vaccine. That's mostly, an early precaution not to get confused about which vaccine is causing which side effects. Now that we really understand the side effects of COVID vaccines, I personally don't think that's too important anymore. There's no biological reason why you can't get vaccines closer together. And as many people know, we often give vaccines simultaneously on the same day. So I don't think that's a big concern any longer.
Dr. Broderick, you were talking about the various variants at the beginning of your slide. So I'd be curious to hear more about, because as somebody who's involved in developing a vaccine at INOVIO, what variants in particular are you keeping a close eye on, and what is that process potentially of tweaking or modifying the vaccine design that you have to keep up with the variants? Is that something that would take a lot of time and effort? Just so you can speak to that piece of things.
Yeah, definitely, Jonathan. So when we at INOVIO, but really all the vaccine developers started, back in January of last year, designing vaccines against COVID-19, we really had one example of the sequence of the virus, and that came from Wuhan in China, to kind of base our designs off of. Today, when we look, there's special websites that kind of combine all the different variants that are being identified on the planet. There's over 500,000 different sequences available for COVID-19. So the ability to now kind of design more bespoke vaccines is definitely something that we can do now that we weren't able to do certainly a year ago, just because that information wasn't available. So really, when I look at the new structures of some of these new variants that are circulating, it does scare me a little bit, because they really are quite different from the original strain of the virus. And I'm not terribly surprised when you see the data that some of the vaccines are less effective against these, because they're really quite different entities. So certainly we and many of the other vaccine developers are looking at kind of coming up with a 2.0 vaccine design that incorporates that original strain that was identified first in China, and now all these new strains. And what we also need to remember is that the virus is going to continue to change. That's just what a virus does. So we know about the UK and the South African and the Brazilian variant strains right now, but there almost certainly will be another one coming around the corner. So we really need to be thinking about designing vaccines to protect against the ones we know about, but also potentially the ones we don't know about. And that's really the challenge for us scientists at the moment.
And so, yeah, speaking of variants, I think the county reported a couple of cases today of the quote unquote Brazil variant here in the region, which has certain mutations that in some studies may make certain kinds of antibodies less effective. But in terms of how scientists keep up with this changing virus, is that a matter of closely looking at the sequence, looking at certain changes in certain parts of the virus? Or can you speak to whether you guys are already doing that, already proposing certain vaccine changes, and are we talking about a matter of, a year to retool a vaccine? Are we talking about months? I think those are things that people are curious about.
Yeah, definitely. So when you or I would go in and get a COVID test done now, and it comes back positive, all that tells us is whether you've had COVID-19 or not. It doesn't tell you what strain of the virus you've been infected with. In fact, on average, across all the states in the US, we're averaging somewhere between 0.5% and 1% sequencing of those different viruses that come back from positive COVID-19 tests. So that surveillance really isn't that great, to be perfectly honest. If we really wanted to be on top of this, we would be wanting to sequence or what we call genotype much more higher number of the samples that we're getting. And if you think that's what we're doing in the US, where we have access to all of the equipment and all of the expertise needed to do that, you can imagine those numbers are considerably lower in other parts of the world. So that's a real concern for me at the moment, that we don't really have those surveillance pieces in place at the moment. So we're maybe a little bit behind on that. But certainly when it comes to redesigning vaccines for some of the more novel technologies like RNA, so the Moderna and the Pfizer, and the vaccines that we're working on, the DNA-based vaccines, it's something that can be done very, very quickly. Because we just use a piece of that genetic sequence, it's super easy just to change out part of that sequence, to modify it, to adapt better to these variants. So this is something that can be done very, very quickly. Of course, they still need to be tested. But the regulatory authorities are really understand the need to be able to move very quickly. And so sometimes some of these testings can be what we call bridged between vaccines that are already existing and some of these small modifications that we might need for these variants. So this is something that can be done relatively quickly.
Yeah, I'll just comment that that's very common with other vaccines, that new versions are made, and we're not going to need to reproduce the very large clinical trials that Dr. Gwathney referred to of 30 or 40,000 people. Once the company makes a new version, we just have to make sure it induces the same immune response, and then we assume that it's going to work.
Right. Yeah, I think the FDA has put out some guidance on that recently. To pivot a little back from vaccine effectiveness to this question of safety, there are a lot of people in the audience who've been wondering about long-term side effects. So you get the shot and you're either monitored, you're asked to sit down for 15 or 30 minutes, and if you feel fine, you can go home and maybe have chills the next day, or feel nothing, or have chills after your second shot. But what do we know about several months down the line or a year down the line, whether you could possibly have any kind of after effects of a vaccine, coronavirus vaccine, based on maybe historical data that we have on what happens to people who get other kinds of vaccines? How likely is it that there would be long-term side effects, and is it something that we simply can't know, or can we say something right now? I'll let anybody who wants to start, we can kind of go around on that.
I can start, and then we can go around. I would be interested to hear Dr. Broderick and others talk about the vaccine development, but I get this question from my patients quite a bit, and I sort of try to simplify it a little bit. I think because a lot of this stuff seems new, it seems like it's entirely a new thing, but we have a lot of experience with vaccines, and pretty much all of them work. They do the same thing, right? Basically, they're training your immune system to respond when it meets the real thing, right? So the most simple form of that is we just take the bug and chop it up and give it to you, right? And then you learn to make an immune response to the proteins, and then your body is ready, your defenses are ready when you see that real infection the next time, right? That's how vaccines work. So I think because some of this is new technology, is very exciting, we've sort of lost track of the fact that it's still basically showing your body a protein, so your body makes a response to it. And so I think when I explain it to patients that way, they feel a little bit more comfortable that they're not going into some brand new thing, that this is a vaccine that shows your body a protein and you produce an immune response. The thing that I think is really interesting and exciting about the mRNA vaccines, for example, and the viral vector vaccines as well, is that you know, especially the mRNA, there's just this little glob of fat and a little piece of mRNA, and that's pretty much it. It goes in there, it produces the protein, your body produces an immune response to the protein, and the rest of the vaccine dissolves away, basically. So there's not a lot, in my opinion, of sort of theoretical worry that it's somehow so different from the other vaccines that we've used in the sense of how your body experiences it. Obviously, we don't have long-term data. This has only been around for a short time, so it would be disingenuous to say, oh, we have long-term experience with all of these. I will say that the Johnson & Johnson and other examples like that have been used for Ebola and other vaccines, so there is some real world experience with them. So that's the kind of things I'm explaining to my patients, is that I don't really see a theoretical concern that this is somehow a very different experience from your body's experience with other vaccines. None of these vaccines integrate into your DNA and stay there forever or anything like that. So those are some of the questions that I think were very reasonable for people to ask. And when I explain to patients like that, they feel a little more comfortable. I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists how they're answering that question.
Well, I guess I'll add to what Dr. Aldous said, that there is no existing vaccine that has some mysterious side effect that happens months or years later. There just isn't such a thing, and biologically it doesn't really make sense that there would be such a thing. So I realize people are having prolonged symptoms after natural infection, and we don't completely understand that yet, but that has not been an issue for people vaccinated so far. But absolutely, you know, the longest observation of a large number of people is 3 months. So it's going to take time to develop that. That's why I mentioned the extensive safety monitoring that is ongoing, real time, using electronic health records to monitor everybody who's gotten vaccinated, or large percentage of people who have been vaccinated, to look for any kind of unusual side effects. So we're looking as hard as we can.
Yeah, you know, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned when we talked about the OB data, because I think it's similar. There's this thing called vSafe when people register, get their vaccine, that they check in with the CDC and say what symptoms they're having. And so we're collecting a ton more data on these vaccines than normal. And so, for example, I believe they said there's been about 50,000 pregnant women that they have data on through that vSafe program, and another 3,000 were enrolled to be monitored. And so you're getting a lot of real-time data about what's happening with these millions of people who receive these vaccines. Again, that doesn't answer that long-term question, but I don't see a theoretical reason why there would be a long-term concern too.
You know what? I'll just chime in really quickly at the beginning with the studies and the FDA. And CDC mandated that the studies give you 8 weeks of data versus, you know, after they finished, because they know that 90% of adverse reactions happen in the first 6 weeks after getting a vaccine. So that's why they mandated at least 8 weeks of data. When I talk to patients about long-term risk of the vaccine, again, we don't know. We do know long-term risks of getting coronavirus, and we know there are various long-term chronic conditions that you will get. So certainly better to potentially get a vaccine that we don't think will have any long-term effects versus knowing something that will have long-term effects. And I'm one of those folks. I'm probably at the 6-month mark now of getting my vaccine. So I'm actually in the Moderna study right now. And so a couple of days from now, it'll be my 6-month mark. I have not had any long-term effects as of yet, and feeling fine, but certainly we're going to get more data pretty soon.
And maybe just a quick basic question for Dr. Broderick. You know, when you get a vaccine shot, how long does the actual molecule, the actual piece of protein or genetic material, you know, stick around? I think that's probably one of the reasons people are asking about these long-term effects.
Yeah, well, Dr. Aldous described it perfectly, really, especially when we talk about the RNA vaccines. So that's the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. Those are, Dr. Aldous is completely right, just a tiny little piece of genetic material. In this case, it's RNA. They wrap it up in a fat droplet, and the reason they have the fat droplets just to make it more effective to get into the body and to keep it safe whilst it gets into the cells. But really, it just gets in, It gives kind of a little blueprint to your cell to make the special spike protein that I talked about. And then that's it. It gets chopped up by your cell. It's a perfectly natural thing that happens every day for lots of other things, and it disappears. So that actual piece of RNA is around for a really short period of time. And as Dr. Aldous said, does not affect your own DNA, which makes you, you, or me, or whatever, has no impact on that whatsoever, and is really only around for a very short period of time. So it's something that's very, very transient. And that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? Because you get something, it's chopped up and it goes away. Well, how does that then protect me from a disease? Well, your body has got this amazing ability to kind of memorize when it's seen something once, then it sticks in its brain and it remembers it, and it's able to continue to use that. That's how something that's only around for a small amount of time is able to really give you this, what we call this long-term protection that we're hoping to get from these vaccines.
And then, sort of related to this whole side effect question, 2 of the 3 vaccines we have right now, Moderna and Pfizer, are 2-shot vaccines, right? You have to come back for that second dose. I think I've heard a lot of questions from people about whether or not they really need to get the second shot, or if you get the first shot and you have pretty uncomfortable side effects, people may be a little hesitant to come back for shot number 2. So maybe Dr. Sawyer, since you've been involved in reviewing the data for the current vaccines, what do we know about the importance of getting both of those shots for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines? And, really, if you have strong side effects for shot 1, are you likely to have, even worse effects for shot 2? Are you less likely to feel much of anything? Can you speak to either of those things?
I mean, these are amazing vaccines. So 1 dose really is quite effective, and it's natural for people to wonder, particularly if they had side effects. I have a different answer to that question today than I did 3 months ago, and it's because of these variants. What we've learned about the variants, although the vaccines are still working, they're not working as well. And the level of antibody you have, the higher the level of antibody you have, probably the better off you're going to be if these variants start circulating. So the reason to get the second dose now of the 2-dose products is to boost your immunity to its maximum, to the level that is really very high, in the hopes that it's going to ward off these variant strains. And speaking of 2 doses, I will share with the audience that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is being studied. A second dose is being studied right now. So, stay tuned. It's conceivable that we may give a second dose of that vaccine once we get all of the data.
Okay. So maybe a follow-up question for you, different question, but one that's right up your alley. So one person was wondering, since the vaccines did receive emergency authorization versus full approval, was there anything the companies didn't have to show to get emergency authorization, that was omitted from this process?
Well, the primary thing is duration of protection and how long the antibodies last. And of course, there's no way to speed that up. For each of these vaccines, during the FDA committee meeting, the companies were asked, when will you apply for formal licensure? And they all said, within 4 to 6 months, when we've accumulated the final data that FDA wants to look at. So I am anticipating that Pfizer, which was the first vaccine approved way back in December, is likely going to come before the FDA again within a month or 2 with follow-up data, which will allow it to be formally, completely licensed the way any other vaccine is.
And maybe a question for Dr. Aldous and Dr. Gwathney. Now that we are starting to see, a good number of people, maybe not the majority, but a good number of people get vaccinated, a lot of folks are wondering, what can I do now, right? What's safe for me to do now? Can I get together with my grandmother or a friend? So if you can give folks some tips in terms of what we know at this moment, I think that'd be super helpful.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just reading this article about how the news tends to report negative things. And I think doctors were so negative all the time. We're like, don't do this, and that's really been necessary because this has been an unprecedented problem with multiple, a lot of death and despair. So I don't want to say that it's not very important, but I think we've gotten so focused that we've forgotten to say to people, you know what? These vaccines have some real benefits. So in the very beginning, we said, please don't change your behavior at all because most people haven't been vaccinated yet. And we still don't know if you can asymptomatically get COVID, even though you don't have any symptoms, and give it to your grandma and all that stuff. And that was all really reasonable advice. But there also should be some benefits to getting vaccinated. And the CDC has now said that if you're vaccinated, you can hang out with other people who are vaccinated also, and it's really low risk. So go for it. They have also said that if you're vaccinated and there's one unvaccinated household and they're not high risk, you can also hang out with them. And there's kind of like some cute guidance on the CDC website with little pictures of households getting together. So I recommend looking at that. It is a balance, right? Because we do need to remember what Dr. Gwathney mentioned, right? We still are in the middle of a pandemic. We still have a lot of cases. So we don't want there to be a lot of like, I've had a vaccine, so 20 different friends are coming over and we're all going to share our COVID. But at the same time, it is, I think, important to tell people that the benefit of being vaccinated is that if your grandma's vaccinated and you're vaccinated, you guys can see each other. And it's time for that. It's been a year. So I think that's a really exciting, important word to get out there. And hopefully will help encourage people to go ahead and get their vaccines.
And,
I do want to also mention that, sorry, just with the asymptomatic thing, Johnson & Johnson actually did look at asymptomatic transmission, and it appears that the vaccine's also effective against asymptomatic transmission. And now we're getting some data on the other two vaccines that it looks like that question of like, could I be vaccinated but still have COVID and spread it asymptomatically? It's looking like the vaccines are also effective against asymptomatic spread. So that's also some good news.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. When at my office, healthcare professionals, most of us have been vaccinated. And, before we would have potlucks and, everyone would gather. Now you come and you grab your food and you go back to your cubicle or your workstation. And so recently we had someone leaving and I told my staff, okay, all of us who've been vaccinated, certainly you can feel free to stay here and eat together. That's okay, because we've been vaccinated. It's been over 2 weeks since you've been vaccinated. That's certainly something to certainly consider in the workplace. If people have been vaccinated, they could potentially eat in a common area with other vaccinated people. And as Dr. Aldous mentioned, there's a Mayo Clinic study that showed 80% effectiveness in preventing asymptomatic spread of coronavirus after getting a vaccine. 80%. The Israeli study, one of the audience members asked about that beforehand, showed about a 94% reduction in symptomatic COVID-19 infections. So these vaccines are preventing both the asymptomatic and the symptomatic infections, which is great to hear for us moving forward.
Please do, however, continue to wear your masks in public because not everyone has been vaccinated, and we do need to keep that going for the time being. So that's why that message feels kind of mixed, because we're like, it's great to be vaccinated. You really can do stuff. So please enjoy yourself. But don't forget that you are a member of the community, and community-wide, we are still in a pandemic. And so in your public life, in your professional life, in the hospital, stuff like that, we still need to follow all the standard precautions until we move to a different phase of this pandemic.
And please don't go to spring break in Miami. It's really that's not the best idea right now. But I don't want to be a Debbie Downer.
Thank you guys for that series of good answers there. I wanted to dig in a little bit into what it means for a vaccine to be effective. So there are all these different percentages that we throw around. Dr. Sawyer, maybe you can speak to when people hear about a vaccine being 70, 80, 90% effective, what is the company actually saying? And what are the different types of ways in which a vaccine can be effective at different levels of disease?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It is so tempting to try to simplify a complicated story with a single number, and that's why people are quoting 94% and 66%. But the studies were quite similar. The formal studies that generated those numbers were to measure the effectiveness at preventing symptomatic mild COVID disease that you notice something. People in the trial were then tested. If they were positive, then the vaccine didn't work. If they were negative, the vaccine did work. So the 94 and 95% is effectiveness at preventing mild symptomatic disease. Well, mild symptomatic disease is no big deal. It's a cold. But what happens, unfortunately, to a small subset of people is that progresses to the severe disease, which we all know about. So a more important measure of the effectiveness of a vaccine is keeping you out of the hospital, keeping you out of the intensive care unit, and keeping you from dying from the vaccine. And I went over it a little quickly, but that's where the 3 vaccines that we currently have work the same. They're all over 90% effective at preventing those really severe outcomes. So you have to be careful with the numbers and really dig a little bit to understand how effective the vaccines are. And they're all great for keeping you from getting really sick. And that's the important message. And that's why you need them no matter what your age or risk factors.
Okay. Now, I think this is probably going to be a difficult question to answer because the vaccine rollout started 3 months ago. So it's hard in the same way to say anything definitive about long-term side effects, talk about long-term efficacy. But maybe Dr. Sawyer, we can start with you, and anybody else who wants to chime in can chime in. How long do we think that these vaccines would protect us against developing COVID-19 for it? And maybe it's different because of the variants and the fact that throws another variable into this whole picture, but anything you can say.
Yeah, it's a very complex topic, and I'll be interested in what the other panelists' opinion is about it. I mean, even before we had SARS-CoV-2, we knew people could get reinfected with regular coronaviruses. There are, quote, normal coronaviruses that just cause common colds, and people could get reinfected with those. So there's something about that virus and some other viruses that allow a reinfection to happen. But it looked quite promising at the beginning of the COVID vaccines that the amount of the vaccines are really potent and they induce a very strong and high immune response that we were thinking would last a long time, at least a year. But I think the curveball is the variants, which have reduced the effectiveness of the vaccine and may reduce the duration of the effectiveness of the vaccine. The good news, if there is any in this story that Dr. Broderick mentioned, it is now very simple to update the vaccine and make a version 2.0. And it may turn out that it'll be like the influenza vaccine, that at least for the next few years, we need to get a new dose every 6 to 12 months until we get a strong, broad immune response to all of the various variants.
Okay. I guess the next question, we've sort of addressed it in a couple of different ways, but because there are 3 different vaccines and there could potentially be a 4th in the future, depending on AstraZeneca or Novavax or the other companies, and maybe Dr. Aldous, I'll start with you. What advice have you been giving to patients who may have a sense that they want the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine or the J&J vaccine? What advice have you been given for folks who are trying to be choosy?
That's funny. I was just typing that into one of the questions in there, so I'll say what I typed. Since the beginning of all of this, I've been advising, and I continue to advise, take the first vaccine available to you. Take the first vaccine you can get, because you don't want to wait around to get whatever your perceived preference is, while meanwhile you get COVID-19 during this very active pandemic. All of these vaccines are, really evidence of the miracle of modern medicine. They are all highly effective. Dr. Sawyer just told you that you're talking about 90 plus, some of them 100%, that you're not going to get hospitalized or die from COVID-19, which is what we're trying to prevent. And that is true for all of the vaccines. I actually, don't have any preference based on the data that I've seen, and I've been following it pretty closely. I really like the J&J because it's one done, one shot, and then 2 weeks later, you're considered fully vaccinated, and you can get all of those benefits of full vaccination that we just talked about. Whereas the other vaccines, you got to wait. You're like 6 weeks waiting for your second dose, so you're considered fully vaccinated. So I think that I do not have a preference. I'm guessing no other panelists do because the CDC does not have a preference. And so that would be a recommendation: is get what you can and be happy about it. And I don't know if others agree.
Seeing a lot of
100%
nodding
agree.
heads.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Let me just add one thing about the Johnson & Johnson, since everyone knows that had the lowest effectiveness, at least against the mild disease endpoint. But one thing the company did, and I did talk about it a little bit, I think earlier, is that part of their study was in South Africa, where the resistant strains were circulating. So we actually have the best data currently about effectiveness, actual effectiveness of preventing disease with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The others, we have indirect evidence that they look like they're working, but we have direct evidence with Johnson & Johnson. So that's another reason to put it up on the same stage with the other 2 vaccines.
And then another side effect question, we're getting a lot of those, for people who had, strong side effects after shot 1 versus shot 2, or, may not have had side effects to either shot. Should that tell them anything about whether they had COVID, whether the vaccine worked? Is there anything you can really interpret from the way that your body responds to either vaccine shot?
I mean, I don't think that you should take anything away from how your body reacts. Everyone reacts differently, and each person may react differently, even in between shot 1 and shot 2. As Dr. Sawyer mentioned before, you do see more side effects after your second dose, your second shot, if there's a second shot, as well as actually older patients over 55 actually have less side effects than younger participants. And that's just because the immune system is then maybe a little more vigorous as you're younger, and you have more of those expected effects that you see. But you shouldn't read too much into, if I didn't react myself, I did not have any reactions or side effects, and I had antibodies 11 days after my shot, because I donate plasma, so they did antibody testing. And had no issues, and I still continue to have antibodies today with no issues. So you shouldn't correlate that at all.
I also want to take what Dr. Gwathney said, and I like how he reframed, because I've been meaning to do this the whole conversation. I try not to say side effects, right? Notice how he said effects, right? They're not side effects, they're the effect of the vaccine, right? A side effect is an unwanted thing that is, occurring on the side of your main desired goal for your medication or vaccine. But in this case, what I tell my patient is there are some expected effects from this vaccine that indicate that it's working. So I don't even really frame them as side effects. I say this is what happens and this is your body's response to it. The guidance is really to go ahead. Unless you had an allergic reaction to the vaccine, the guidance is to go ahead and continue with your vaccine series. These are effects that show that you're having an immune response, which is the purpose of the shot. And so that's how I counsel my patients about that.
And for folks who are having those effects, maybe it's the headache's a little stronger than they wanted to, what are you telling patients in terms of what they can do for themselves beyond resting and drinking fluids? Can you take a Tylenol? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I certainly think that the CDC, just to make the point, you can certainly take Tylenol, Motrin, or anything after you've received your vaccine to treat any particular effects that you're having. They do specifically recommend not to take any medications prior to, so don't pre-medicate at this point. They're not really sure how that would affect, your response to the vaccine. But if after you take your vaccine and you have any headaches, body aches, joint pains, things like that, certainly feel free to take Tylenol or Motrin to help with your effects.
Okay. And this question might be one of our last ones. We're coming up on time, but it's more of a big picture question And I think Dr. Gwathney and Dr. Aldous, you both spoke about the fact that we're still in a pandemic right now, right? Even though our numbers are lower than they were a couple of months ago, we're still in a pandemic. A lot of people are still getting COVID, but we are starting to see more and more people get vaccinated. So I'd just be curious to get your sense of where are we in this pandemic? Do you get a sense of, are we solidly in the middle? Are we closer to the end? And then how does vaccinating more and more people factor into us being able to return to more and more pieces of normal life? We talked about how after you get vaccinated, you can get together with somebody else who's been vaccinated for lunch, or get together with somebody in a single household who is low risk. So yeah, just your outlook on vaccination being able to get life back to some semblance of normal. Maybe Dr. Aldous, we'll start with you and kind of go around.
That's kind of a hard question. After a year of the pandemic, we learned not to, prognosticate too much and to be cautious. So I am cautiously optimistic right now. It's hard because we've been under this for so long. It's like I'm not really sure what the light at the end of the tunnel looks like. But we have seen some sort of dire predictions from people in the field of looking at the modeling around the variants. But those predictions all kind of said, we can modify this with vaccination. And I do want to point out that San Diego County has been a leader in getting our people vaccinated, even though we still have massive health inequities that we need to address. We've done a really good job of getting our people vaccinated. So if we can keep the supply coming, we actually would have vaccinated a lot more people, except there was a big supply dip a couple of weeks ago that affected all of the county. So if we can keep the supply up, keep the advocacy going for ensuring that we reach the populations that are the most at risk, I do feel like I see a light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think that we're going to have no COVID in the fall. But I think we will have a much more manageable situation. We know how to manage it now. We know how to get kids back to school. We know a lot more than we knew at the beginning. So I do think we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't think we're going to be COVID-free completely as the next school year starts. We'll have some kind of modified lifestyle, I think, for a little while longer. That's my prediction, but predictions are not a good idea to make.
Jonathan, could I jump in there?
Please.
Yeah, so definitely completely agree, Dr. Aldous. The one thing I would say, and I just mean this because I think we need to be realistic here, is if you look at some of the infection rates in Europe, unfortunately, at the moment, for instance, Italy and France have both gone back into a third lockdown now because their rates are really on the increase. That certainly we should make our seal. I think we should be very proud of what we've achieved here in San Diego and in the US as a whole. I mean, we've really done remarkably well getting the vaccines out to people who need them. And certainly that's not the case in Europe at the moment. Their vaccination rates are much less. But I guess I just would love to just express to everybody that we really don't want to drop our guards right now. We've made so much progress that kind of letting it all go now would be really not a great idea. So there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel. We just have to hold on a little bit longer, get more of those people vaccinated, and I think we'll be in a much better place, certainly by the end of the year.
I'll jump in and be a little bit more optimistic. I think the science is really going to help us here. Again, the pace at which scientific discovery is happening around this virus and the number of people studying it is incredible. We're learning how to treat the disease. We're getting more therapeutic agents to treat it. We're learning now about the vaccines. We may have additional vaccines. We're learning how to wear a mask. And if we unfortunately follow Europe's path and start to have another surge, hopefully we'll finally convince a larger percent of our population to wear a mask, because they will see that it keeps coming back if we don't. And so, I think we're stuck with COVID for years to come, but it may settle down to something maybe like influenza, maybe even less severe than influenza. We'll, that we'll have to see.
Sure, and I'll just finish out here when I, several months ago in August, September, October, saying the difference between flu and coronavirus at that point was we didn't have any treatments and we didn't have any vaccines. which we do for influenza. And we do have that right now. We have treatments, as monoclonal antibodies, remdesivir, and we have vaccines, 3 different vaccines. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, but I'm hoping we can learn from Europe and learn from what we've done in the past. Every time Europe has something, we've followed suit, we followed behind them. And so we could certainly learn a lot from what's going over there and prevent what's happening over there from happening here if we actually take the time to see what's happening and learn from what's happening there and try and prevent it here. So I think there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank all the panelists for sharing their thoughts and all the people in the audience for asking questions. I know we didn't get to every last question, but it looks like we're going to be collecting the ones we haven't responded to and trying to address those via email or maybe through social media. So yeah, once again, thank you guys so much. And there might be somebody to kick it back to at the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center, but thank you guys for having me. Thanks for holding me.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers tonight. We really do appreciate you taking the time. Particularly appreciate all the work that you have been doing in getting us to this point, both from everything from the initial research, the vaccine research, the rollout, and particularly for tonight in taking the time to communicate the information and the understanding that you have gained to all of us. This has been a very traumatic time for many people. And for all of you to take the time and share your expertise and information with us and communicate in a very clear and concise way is very extraordinarily helpful. To all the folks who have attended tonight, thank you for coming. We will have the recording of this panel online on the Fleet's website coming out, so you should be able to review it there. We will try to get to other questions and provide other information as best we can. And if there are other things and questions that you have, other issues or people who need to be connected to experts like these or others, the Fleet really is here to help connect all of San Diego to the amazing and incredible science and technology expertise and opportunities that we do have in this county. So please do feel free to reach out, and we will do everything we can to keep connecting you to all the great opportunities and information that is available. So thank you all again. I wish we could give you I'll have to give you the applause myself because we can't hear it from the rest of the audience. Hopefully the next time, well, hopefully we won't have to do a panel like this. Nothing personal again, but hopefully we won't have to do this again. But hopefully the next time we have some opportunity to connect you all with our audience, we'll be able to give you a rousing round of applause. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again to our supporters for helping make this tonight happen, and all the staff who pulled this together, and all of you for coming out. Thank you all, and good night.